Afternoon. My name is Larry Lynn with the Social Sciences Subcommittee, and welcome to In Service to Others, a history of Holland's women missionaries. Our speaker today is Ricki Levine, who has been the executive director of the Holland Museum since 2017. She has worked for almost 2 decades in West Michigan nonprofit cultural organizations, including the Frauenthal Center in Muskegon, St. Cecilia Music Center in Grand Rapids, and the Mason Street Warehouse in Saugatuck. Prior to that, she worked in the for-profit sector in major metropolitan areas where her focus was on merchandising, sales, and marketing. Originally from the New York metropolitan area, Ricki came to the Holland area from Los Angeles. She holds a BA from George Washington University and a certificate of completion, bear with me, it's a long sentence, a certificate of completion from the University of South Florida Muma College of Business Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Workplace program. She is a 2019 graduate of the West Coast Chamber Leadership Program, a 2022 graduate of LEAD 24, and serves on the board of directors of Lakeshore Nonprofit Alliance. Ricki lives in Saugatuck with her husband, Mark, her cat, Roxy, and her dog, Yoshi. Please join me in welcoming Ricki Levine.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you very much that you got all of that in. I know it was a challenge. Hello, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here. I have done HASP programs for the last several years, and they've all been virtual. So I get real live people here, and that's really exciting. So welcome, and welcome to those of you that are watching via Zoom. So it's a delight to talk to you folks from HASP, and you're always an interested and engaged audience. So it is absolutely my pleasure to tell you what's going on in the museum. And I am definitely going to be talking about this exhibit and this subject, but I would not be doing my job as executive director if I didn't tell you everything else that's going on at the museum. So we're going to dive into that first. And I do want to start with our land acknowledgement statement. This is something we created about a year ago with some Indigenous people from the community. And even though we're not in the Holland Museum properties, I feel like since I'm talking about the museum, I should share the land acknowledgement statement. The Holland area surrounds Lake Makatawa, ancestrally known to the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Peoria nations as Mekakudami, or Black Lake. Each nation has their own rich cultural traditions and beliefs that still, that still survive today. We, the Holland Museum, acknowledge that this land is sacred, and we commit to honoring the land and the Indigenous peoples who have stewarded it for generations through our continuing education, partnerships, and self-reflection. Thank you. So a lot of people know this, and a lot of people forget, and then some of you might not know this. We actually have 4 venues that are part of the museum. The Holland Museum, which was the former post office on 10th Street, the Capon House, which was Isaac Capon's house. He was the first mayor of Holland, and he built this house after the Great Fire of Holland. And he was probably the wealthiest man in the community at the time. He was also a partner in the tannery that was located at where the Holland Civic Center is now. The Settlers House is just 4 houses up the street, and the comparison of the 2 homes is really quite remarkable. This house was built, and we just found out in the census that it was Tom Morrissey, who was an Irish ship sailor, is how they have him in the census. But in other documentation, we heard that he was an Irish ship carpenter. So we're going to cover all bases and say he was probably both. He built the house, and multiple families lived in that home up until the early 70s. It's been restored back to a period that's comparable to the Capon House of the late 1800s. Admission gets you into both of the properties, and it's what I call the haves and the have-nots of the 1800s. It's really wonderful to see the disparity that we still are experiencing today in our communities and our country. The last property is the Armory, and the Armory is actually owned by the Holland Museum. The other properties, the other 3 properties, are owned by the City of Holland. We pay them a nominal rent to run them as museums. And so the Armory, we have administrative offices. We also do events there. We rent out the space. We do have our trivia night fundraiser and other events that are museum events, but it's a very mobile kind of space. We use it for a lot of things, and we probably have a lot of potential to use it for more. So, as I said, we have the museum where we do rotating exhibits, we do lectures, we have events and programs, and we have Spark Lab. And Spark Lab is the Smithsonian Spark Lab, which is a hands-on invention space for children and their families to learn the process of invention. It was created at the Lemlinson Center, which is part of the Smithsonian. And the reason they did this is they said, we are a country of inventors, and we are not teaching children the process of invention. And so they have created these satellite spaces. We are the 3rd and last one in Michigan. And the activities rotate all the time, and kids are learning the process of invention, but they're also learning trial and error and failure. A little bit different than a children's museum where kids are there to play, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with children's museums. But what we're doing here is we give them a problem to solve. And then we give them some things to use to help solve that problem. And the activities rotate all the time, so children and their families or school groups learn something new every time they come to the museum. So current temporary exhibits, again, I promise we will be talking about in service to others, but the other temporary exhibit we have right now is this one, which is, and I can't see it because I have the screen up at the same time, but it is Greetings from Holland, Oranges, an Impact of the Local Post Office. And this was, it is a great exhibit that was created by our summer interns. They put their heart and soul in it. And it's a wonderful place to see about the post office in the former post office. And in fact, we always get, I hear this from my staff all the time, several times a year, people come and say, where do I drop my mail? So I think it's still a post office. It's not, hasn't been for quite some time. The Capon and Settlers House, we have historic home tours. We do the ice cream social. We have Victorian Christmas and a whole lot of other events. And it's quite versatile in that respect as well, and a lot of fun. The Armory, as I said, we use it as a rental space. We've done, local school groups have rented it. Churches rent it. We've had quinceanera receptions, wedding receptions, just to name a few. We've also had the Big Read exhibition has been there every year. They haven't done it since COVID, and they're not doing it this year, but we hope to get that back at some point. And then we use it for our own fundraisers. We have administrative offices in the upper floors. We don't have enough room at the museum for all of our administrative offices, so we're kind of split. Then downstairs in the basement, as Rick will tell you, is a treasure trove. That's where our artifacts are stored, the ones that are not on display. And there is so many wonderful things in that space. We would not be doing our job as a museum if education was not our focus. So we do a lot of different education, both inside and outside the space, the building spaces that we do. We collaborate with a whole lot of other organizations. There's youth education, there's outreach, there's programs for adults and families both. I'd like to highlight the middle photo here, which is our Meet Up and Eat Up. This is something we do with the Ottawa Health Department every summer. These a program for kids that are not getting a school lunch because school is out of session and need that extra meal during the day. So the health department feeds the kids, and we come and bring a cultural brain stimulating activity. A lot of the times we bring some of our Spark Lab activities. So it's really a great opportunity for these kids to get engaged and not just have their lunch. Anybody recognize this eyesore? This was what the Père Marquette caboose looked like not too long ago. And over the course of last year, the museum was able to renovate the outside of it. This is what it looks like now. Yes, doesn't it? We were able to do this with help from a lot of individuals to help us raise money, a lot of organizations with both money and in-kind support. And we are working to raise some funds so we can actually do the inside of the caboose for people to visit as well. So we're not there yet, but in the meantime, it's an exhibit. So we have bilingual signage up where you can learn about the Père Marquette line, you can learn about the caboose, what it was like to work on a train, and it's not an eyesore anymore. So we're very pleased about that. Yes, it's at the Padnes Transportation Center. Thanks, Rick. So if you want to go see it, bring your grandkids. It's a great place to visit. One of our absolute values is accessibility. That's one of our priorities, to make sure we are as accessible to the community as possible. And we do that a few different ways. We are open on the second Monday of every month for free in the evening from 4 to 6 p.m. Thanks to the generosity of the Meyer Foundation. And so this allows the community to come in no matter what their economic situation is. It also is an evening hours, so some people can't come during the day, our normal hours. So it's a great way to bring people in. We also have special admission programs. We do programs for veterans, active military, educators, those that have EBT card holders. We also collaborate with Community Action House and Herrick District Libraries, so there's accessibility for free for their members and clients as well. We're open every year, and we've done this since 2018. So it's our 5th Martin Luther King Day Junior celebration all day. We concentrate on the civil rights movement. We concentrate on the legacy of Dr. King, and we make that a free day for the community as well. We encourage school groups to come in. We encourage families with kids that are off that day to come in as well. And we've had really a great response to this programming, even during COVID, which was great. I like to pause on this slide because I get so excited when I talk about this. We have over 100,000 items in our collection, and obviously they can't be on display all the time. So, and we know we have that many because we did a full inventory, the first in the history of the museum, which was established in 1837. 1937, excuse me, I'm making it older than it is, but 1937, we have never done a full inventory until 2019. So we know exactly the numbers that are in the collection. And in 2018, we started digitizing the collection, and that collection constantly grows. So those numbers you see in orange, the 1595 and the 150 categories, changes every time I do this presentation, which is really exciting. I have to call Rick, my registrar, and say, how many do we have now? And I always change it. And it's great to see how much they've been able to do. There's a ways to go with 100,000 items, but this collection, the digital collection, is available online. So anybody goes to the museum website and can connect to this collection. So you could be somebody writing a book on the West Coast, or you could be a child during COVID who can't get out and go and do some research at the library, and they would have access. So we're really proud of this. Please go to our website, hollandmuseum.org, and check it out. We're always adding to it as well. Looking forward, we do everything we do, whether it's our exhibitions, our programs, our events, are about our mission, following our mission, preserving our past, imagining our future. And that certainly is about the exhibits too. And so now we are here, and I'm going to talk about the Missionary exhibit, which we opened in July, and it runs through Thanksgiving week in November. And it's in service to others, and it's about in the 1850s. I'm going to just move this so I can see, because I can't see my notes. There we go. In the 1850s, American women became much more vocal on that they wanted to do things more outside of the home. And in the US, mission agencies routinely would not allow women, single women, to join a mission. They could be, as a woman, the homemaker to a missionary husband, but they couldn't do it on their own. And the American missionary movement was born out of that time period. This is Nellie Churchfield. She began the Holland Rescue Mission, which is now known as Gateway Mission, in about 1902. And on Saturday evenings, she would set up a tent on 8th Street, and preach the gospel. So she was not a missionary that served abroad, but she certainly was a missionary right here in Holland. So Holland's religious community embraced the national trends toward involvement in the 1880s. The Women's Foreign Missionary Society was born. And Holland, as part of the Reformed Church of America, encouraged women, single women, to serve others in whatever capacity that they were able to do so. This is a picture of the nursing class from 1938. This is the class of the Presbyterian Hospital School of Nursing, which is located in Chicago. And the highlighted names and faces that I have put on here are all women from Holland and Michigan, and all of them served abroad. So quite a few, and actually one of these names you will see later on when we talk a little bit more about some of the specific women involved. In 1861, the Women's Foreign Missionary Society was founded. Several dozen other organizations followed, striving to include women in this work. And missionary work then became a viable option for single women who were unable to fill some of these roles in their own communities. They could be doctors, they could be educators, fundraisers, and leaders. And this image of these women from the First Reformed Church, they all served in Japan. And they, this is, I believe, in about 1965, and we think this is when they had all come back after retiring from their mission work, or at least their mission work abroad. I am going to be sharing some names. I am, as Larry introduced me, I am not a native, so my Dutch pronunciations may come into question, so please forgive me. And some of my Chinese and Indian pronunciations are also challenging for me, so forgive me. But I mentioned the Capon house. This is Lizzie Capon. So she was one of Isaac Capon's many children. He actually had two families. He had two wives and two full families from each of those wives. That's another presentation. But Lizzie was from the first wife. She was from the first family. And she was a missionary in Amoy, China. She was the first member of the Third Reformed Church who served as a foreign missionary. I should say she was the first woman. I think that was, that's an error to say she was the first person, but she was the first woman. She went to Amoy, China. She began as a teacher in a girls' school in Fujian province, where she was instrumental in the expansion of education and included founding a new school in Jiangsu. She also served 14 years at a hospital. And at the end of that 14th year, she contracted an illness and came back to Holland, Michigan. And unfortunately, she died shortly after. But what I think is fascinating is in her will, she bequeathed to the Missionary Union $200 and $1,900 to the hospital in Amoy, which is significant money for that time. Again, her father had been the wealthiest man in the region, so she might have inherited quite a bit of that money, but that was pretty generous for that time. Born in 1870 is Ida Scudder, and this is, remember the name Scudder because it will come up again. She was the granddaughter of the first American missionary in India, Dr. John Scudder. And she was a child of missionaries, and most of her relatives became missionaries, and she swore she would never become a missionary. And she was visiting her parents in 1894 in India, and she was horrified because she observed 3 women dying in childbirth. And the local custom was men could not treat the women, and that was a big part of why they died. And so that changed her life. She came back to the United States, graduated from Cornell University Medical School as part of the first class to accept women. And then she spent the rest of her life in India, serving both men and women, training them in the medical field. She went to rural villages herself, bringing healthcare to those. And she died in 1960, right after her 90th birthday. And this is amazing to me too, that these women from the 19th and early 20th centuries, many of them lived incredibly long lives, and they were serving in countries that didn't have many health opportunities. So quite impressive in that respect. Lois Marzilge, how'd I do? Marzilge? That's what I thought it was, but I listened to it phonetically online and they said Marzilge. It is Marzilia. Okay, thank you. She, unlike Ida, always wanted to be a missionary. So she focused on that really her whole life. She studied at Hope College. She was a member of the First Church of Holland, and she received her nurse's training from the Presbyterian Holland School in Chicago. She was one of those women that was in the picture that I showed you earlier, and she graduated in 1938. In 1950, she received her master's from the University of Chicago. In 61, she co-authored a textbook for nurses specifically in India. Towards the end of her time in India, she was the dean at Scudder Hospital School. Scudder Hospital, remember? John Scudder, who was the grandfather of Ida. That was the hospital that was named after him. And she retired in 1974, died in Holland in 2001. And in 1905, Edith Walverd and her husband Anthony were missionaries. They went to Nagasaki, Japan. Anthony taught at the Steel Academy and Edith taught at a girls' school. She taught music. And most of her service was involved with the school and her children, but she also actively raised 3 girls of her own, which this period of time in this community made an impact on them. She returned home after Anthony died in Japan, and she died at the age of 97 when she came home. So she had a very long life as well. Jeannie Walverd is the middle daughter of Anthony and Edith, and she was a missionary in China, the Philippines, and Taiwan between 1931 and 1964, I believe it is. In her last 12 years of her service, she was the director of nursing at Mackay Hospital School in Taipei. So think about some of these careers that these women would not have been able to do in the US at that time. Okay, I'm going to really not do these names well, but Jean Nienhuis. Jean was your great aunt? Oh, wonderful. And Helen Joldsma. They were both in China from the 1920s. In Jean's case, she was there until 1952. And really, there were a lot of hot spots that a lot of these women, missionaries, really all of the missionaries that served abroad, many of them were in really political hot spots with a lot of political unrest. And despite the danger, these women persevered and wanted to serve these communities. In China in particular, and remember, these 2 women were in China, there were often processions and slogans in the 1900s that were against foreign governments, anti-Christian feelings. There were billboards and posters and really just a lot of unrest. And Helen, shortly after she arrived in Amoy, it was Christmas. And on Christmas Day, there was a huge protest and a huge procession. And Helen didn't know the language at all. So she thought it was a celebration of Christmas. So she joined along until one of her fellow missionaries pulled her aside and got her out and explained what was going on. But really, when you think about how people perceived the missionaries that were coming in and really proselytizing in many cases, what that did to an indigenous community. And that's something we don't shy away from in this exhibit, even though we celebrate these women and their accomplishments and the good deeds that they did. These are more images of Jean. She died after returning to Holland. She was over 100 years old. So as I said, the museum focuses mostly on the empowerment that this work provided American women in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but it's really important to recognize that a lot of people serve as missionaries, and sometimes they believe they know better than those of the indigenous community, and they suppress cultural beliefs, rituals of those people. And Helen was one of the few people that I'm talking about today that did not live a long life. She actually died 2 years after she got to Amoy from pancreatitis. But this document that I've highlighted here were first impressions that her friends gathered, and there were things from her diary and things from her letters home. And what I felt was important to recognize is some of the comments that she had about her first impressions of China. So the first one is that she felt how richly God has blessed America. We're such a wealthy country compared to these people. But then she goes on to talk about the idols that these people were praying to that were dusty and horrific looking, and how they could not do what God could do. Then these poor people were praying to these idols in vain. And she ends it by saying, Satan has certainly blinded their eyes, and China needs our prayers so much. And that's an indication of somebody who really wasn't open to the cultural differences in the community she was serving. Granted, she had only been there a short time, so hopefully she changed her world. Yes. That's your
Linda.
I'm sorry, you gotta get a mic so that they can hear you on Zoom.
My thought is that when she says Satan has certainly blinded their eyes, she's not blaming them. She's not saying these stupid people they have the capacity to realize that what she's bringing to them will lift them up. So, I mean, in a way, it sounds terribly dismissive of the beliefs of the Chinese, but in another way, it's not blaming them. It does have that evangelical idea that it's just because God hasn't blessed them as much as America. Of course, that's a colonialized idea, but they're seeing so much squalor and misery that how could you not say how blessed is America compared to this? You can't even really blame them for saying, if they're saying if they would just become Christians, they'd get rich, that would be terrible. You know what I mean?
Wait, no, and I agree with you. I mean, at first, it's an observation.
Yeah.
This is a poor, at least the region she was in was terribly
Yeah.
poor, and how rich we are as a country comparatively. The comments, and it's an interesting observation that the comments about, how she's not blaming them, and I didn't think she was blaming them either, but she was saying her way was the only way.
Yeah.
And
I think your observation that she's making these observations when she first got there, she's not yet talking in the way the missionaries do about this when they're more experienced. When they have more experienced, they're not quite so likely to bring up Satan in every sentence and things like that.
And I think you're also right, and I will point that out in a little bit also, that contemporary missionaries are very different than perhaps this period of time. If anybody's ever seen the movie The Mission, it's a incredibly powerful movie. Robert De Niro's in it, and it's about the Spanish mission and what they did to the indigenous people there. So there's lots of different sides to the story for sure. But I think that's important for everybody to recognize that there are both sides. So I invite you to come visit the exhibition. Let us know what you think about the work and the lives of these women that we highlight. And as well as those of you who might have connections to any missionaries, whether it's your family or somebody that you know, because we're always looking to collect more stories about Holland and the history of Holland. So we do have a number of programs that we always do in relation to the exhibits. And the two I want to highlight here are, the first one is was actually done already, but it was recorded and you can see it on our website, and it's Voices of Holland Women Missionaries. It's a wonderful conversation with these 4 retired missionary women. And to your point, they talk about respecting culture. I know Rick was at the program. They also talk about listening was such an important part. And so I think, you know, many contemporary missionaries have a different mindset than they perhaps did some time ago. So that is available on our website. Again, it's free. It's also available on our YouTube channel to watch any of our past programs that we tape. And then tomorrow, you still have time to sign up for this one. It's a Zoom event, biblical imagery in unlikely places, Christianity and early 20th century Chinese. This is done by Professor Gloria Sang from Hope College. She's a history professor. And welcome you to sign up for that. You can go to our website. That starts at 7 o'clock. It will be recorded as well. So all of our Zoom presentations for sure are available. They're the best recordings that we have. The ones that we do in person, like we did the Voice of Holland Women, is with a stand-up video cam. So it's not going to be a technology savvy kind of a program, but you'll be able to hear them. And like I said, they were just fabulous to listen to. So those are the 2 programs that are exhibit related. We also do a series we call Cultural Lens. And in the Cultural Lens series, we celebrate and talk about people, many of marginalized communities. Sometimes it's a deep dive and it's, you know, tough listens. Sometimes it's a celebration. So we have a couple of things that are actually celebrations right now. We have the Idlewild, the Black Eden of Michigan. C.J. Greer, who some of you may know, is a local historian. He grew up in Idlewild. He knows his subject intimately. That's going to be at the museum. Dia de los Muertos, which is the Day of the Dead. It's the Mexican celebration. And that will be at the Armory. And that's a huge celebration. We'll have music, we'll have theater performers, we'll have dancers, open, free to the community. We do that in collaboration with Latin Americans United for Progress. And then Holidays Around the World is our 2nd year of doing this, where we introduce different holidays so that people and children can learn that there are different holidays than those that are celebrated mostly by this community. Other upcoming programs, another series that we do is the Tales from the Archives, which is related to people that dive into our archives and learn about something that's local and want to share it. So we have, and Dr. Henry Ludekhuizen has done some past programs, some of them in collaboration with the museum, but he's doing a 2-part series called Describing Nature in 17th Century Dutch Art. There's part 1, November 10th, and part 2, November 17th. Those are at the museum, so you need to register for those. And this next one is a collaboration between Hope College as well as Herrick District Library, the Ottawa County Poor Farm. And that's going to be held at the district library. So again, sign up for those. And just another program that didn't kind of fit into one of our categories, we're celebrating our hometown heroes. And we have a number of different people coming from different walks of life that we celebrate because they work to create change in different areas. And that's one of our second Monday programs. So it's in the evening, November 14th. Again, it's free. And there is an opportunity to adopt a pet because one of our heroes is somebody from Harbor Humane. So, you know, come with an open mind. We do seasonal programming as well. We've got these cemetery tours coming up. This is, if you went to on our cemetery tour last year, these are different tours. So you'll visit different history in our cemetery. And there's 2 dates for that. And there's rain dates if those are not good weather days. Victoria Christmas at the Capon House is just a lovely event. We decorate it with the the Garden Club, the Holland Garden Club is just a terrific asset to us, and they help us decorate and make it look as if it were a Victorian time, and that's a Victorian home. So it's a great way to see the Capon House, and also it's a great family activity day as well. And then I mentioned holidays around the world too. Have to talk about membership because that's my job to do. We have 3 membership levels. So as little as $35 gets you a membership. It gives you access to the museum, and you can always bring a friend with you. So it's not just for one person. And then there's levels that go up that can actually include children or grandchildren to come, both adult children and grandchildren. And in the premium level, the 125, you actually become a member of the North American Reciprocal Museum Program, which means, and it's not just North America anymore, it's actually expanded. You can go to museums all over the world with membership to the museum, gives you access, free admission. We don't do it with Grand Rapids because they limit the geographical range, but Chicago, many of the museums in Chicago, which are quite pricey to get to. If you do that kind of trip, it's worthwhile getting a membership with us. The way that we are doing our next fundraiser is one of our Preserving Our Stories fundraisers. Has anybody done any of the Preserving Our Stories fundraisers, Rick? Nobody else. Okay, so these are virtual fundraisers that we started doing during COVID because we couldn't all be together like this. But what has really fits for us, because it really fits into our mission, is we take a story of a family-owned business, multi-generational family-owned business that's still owned by the family, still run by the family, and we tell their story. And we let them tell their story, really. We bring them together and we have hours of documentation of their story. The fundraiser is not hours long, but you could access the full collection if you want to on our website afterwards. But the night of the event, we condense it into a short little video that talks about who they are and how they got together and how their generations work together and what their transitions have been with their business. We have highlighted the Fabianos from the Holland Peanut Store, the Kleinhexels from Dykstra Funeral Home. The last one we did was the Geyer family from Holland Bowl Mill, who did the wooden shoe company originally. And the next one is the Neelis family from Neelis Dutch Village. It's being run by 4th generation owners now, and 5th generation actually do some work at the place as well. So who knows if they'll be taking over in the future. But that is a virtual event. It's a fundraiser. We raise money for all of our educational programs with this event. So you can find that information online as well. Our current hours are Monday, Fridays, and Saturdays from 10 to 5. Again, we're open the free second Mondays from 4 to 6. And then, is it 7? Okay, it's 7. This is our volunteer, our docent, our man of all tricks and trades. So he knows better than I do because he works some of those second Mondays.
Ricki, let me interrupt you a second.
Sure.
If you folks would please raise your hand before you make a comment or ask a question. The Zoom audience cannot hear what's going on, and some of us don't hear the question. So if you please just hesitate and raise your hand, and I'll run over to you, or Ian will. So thank you.
So the question was the hours for second Monday, and it's 4 to 7. So there's an error on the slide. Thank you, Rick. I'm glad you're here. Spark Labs Smithsonian fall hours have changed. So they're Monday and Friday, 1 to 5, and Saturdays from 11 to 3. People ask all the time, how can I help the Holland Museum? Well, let me tell you, there's lots of ways to help the Holland Museum. Certainly become a volunteer like Rick. We have docents, but people don't always know about other things that you can do in a museum. You don't necessarily have to be somebody giving tours. We have people in the back end of things. We have people on committees. We have people looking at our collections. We have administrative needs. So if there's any interest in being a volunteer, we have an opportunity for you. Be a member. It's a nominal amount if you'd like to join. 10 programs. Like I said, most of our programs are free. We encourage donations, but they are mostly free. Visit the museum, invite a friend, bring a friend. Tomorrow is the first day of fall, so the holidays are about to be here. So come visit our gift shop. We have wonderful items for gifts as well. And then become a donor. That is always something people think, and I don't know if anybody in this room is guilty of this, that we are owned by the City of Holland. We are not. We are run as a 501c3 nonprofit. The City of Holland's buildings, we rent from them, but as I said, at a nominal amount, but they are not the sole supporter of the Holland Museum. So there are lots of reasons that individuals can help and support us, and then attend our fundraisers, including the one that's coming up in November. I do want to remind you to register for these upcoming events tomorrow, the one on September 26th, 2nd, October 6th, October 8th and 15th for the tours of the cemetery, and then preserving our stories. Upcoming exhibits. So one more this year after this particular exhibit closes. As I said, it was the end of November. On December 9th, we're opening up a new exhibit called Storied Objects, and it's folk art from our own collection. And again, as I said, we have so many items in storage that don't come out very often, and this will have some treasures. And that's just one little sample of a quilt that is part of the collection. And then on May 6th, so this is next year, we are bringing in a traveling exhibit. Jane Jones is a still life artist, and she says, and you can see it by her work, is very much inspired by Dutch 17th century art. And so it'll tie in really beautifully with the Dutch art we have in our collection. There's lots of programming that are going to be involved with that, including, we hope, Jane coming and speaking as well. So that'll be really exciting. And then it's during tulip time, so it's a perfect time for that. So, and that's going to be a pretty brief run because we're paying for it. So it's not as long as some of the things that we can do from our own collection. And I know we've been engaging with questions and answers, but if there are any other questions, I'm more than happy, and Larry will run over with his mic.
Thank you, Ricki. I learned a lot. So anybody have a question?
Have you had good response so far to the missionary exhibit? What is the traffic like, and what are people saying or telling you as they see it?
Yeah, great question. We've actually had really good traffic. And in fact, the night that the 4 women came and spoke, when we do programs in the museum, we open up our exhibits so they can go see it as well. A lot of those folks were missionaries that came to see them speak. And you're one of them, aren't you?
I don't think I was there that night, but I am part of that mission. There are a lot of retired missionaries in Holland, in case we don't all know this.
Yeah, and quite a few of them were there. Some actually active missionaries were also there.
Yeah.
So it was really well attended, and the feedback we got from the exhibit was very positive.
Tremendous, I'm sure it was.
We have a very small exhibit space, so we only highlighted some women. We would have loved to have done much more, and there are a lot more stories out there.
There are a lot more stories out there.
Yeah.
Were you able to exhibit any of the letters of any of the women missionaries that you did feature? I mean, maybe that gets into too much detail. You can't really.
We do have some of the writings, but I'm not sure how much of them are actually on exhibit.
They would have all been prolific letter writers, and to show maybe a few of their letters back home to tell everybody what they were observing and seeing. And especially since at the time that the earliest missionaries were serving in China, there was tremendous racial mistrust and hatred in this country.
Sure.
I mean, the Chinese Exclusion Act was the first act that prohibited any foreign people of a certain type to come in here. It was China that was the first victim of that. And so the missionaries were out there to some extent helping to soften that image or change it and affect the people living back home, not to view the Chinese the way that most of the secular culture was, or I don't know, whatever, to try to affect that. Not that some of those prejudices didn't show up in the letters, but it would be a potential very interesting display to show more of the letters. I do know over at the archives, at the Joint Archives in Holland, the number of people who come into the Joint Archives in order to check out and read missionary letters is stunning.
They have a huge collection over there.
People are
Yes.
terribly, very interested in, I mean, maybe a particular missionary, but there are so many letters, and then what they show is interesting.
Thank you for sharing that.
I'd like to hear what the grandniece of Jean Nienhuis has to say.
Well, great Aunt Jean was my mother's aunt. And I just remember her being kind of the matriarch, you know, when she came home, and we'd visit her and talk with her. And of course, we were kind of overwhelmed with it because at that time, we realized China had become communist and that she had been there during a lot of that period and had experienced some very, very scary things. And it was interesting to see her interpret what God did to protect them, that they felt he had done to kind of put a protection barrier around them so that the soldiers didn't come through. For some reason or the other, they seemed to realize that they shouldn't touch this particular school they were working in or the missionaries. So it was interesting, you know, when at a very young age. But I have to tell you a little bit more about her, just because when she met my husband to be, she said, "Oh, he's not Dutch, he's a foreigner." Now he was, you know, I mean, he was
American.
American and, you know, a little English background, a little Irish background, but he wasn't Dutch. So some things did stay the same.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I wonder, do you have any specific stories about the political unrest that she lived through?
I was really too young to comprehend most of it I was too young to really get my head around most of it when she first came home. So a lot of it was secondhand.
Right.
Boy, I don't know if I can remember that actually.
I think I have that in the presentation. Let me see if I can find it.
And I have to admit, it wasn't until I was out of high school and college that I kind of got a sense of how much she had done, because, you know, it's just another member of the family. Yeah. So I was kind of oblivious to it until I saw a little more of the world myself.
Yeah, I can't.
But I would tell you also, I have some artifacts that I ended up with, all of them that she had given to people. You may end up with them, because I'm sorry, the new generation doesn't have appreciation for any of that kind of thing. So
Their loss, our gain.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, Larry, I have Larry, quick question too, from one of our online viewers. Recognized one of the names on there from that 4-member panel. Kathleen, was that you? Well, we'd love to hear some of your experience as well, if you'd be happy to share them with
That's
us.
why I
while you're here.
recognize you.
Larry, would you mind just letting Kathleen, because one of the questions you received online, Kathleen, was, are there any stories or accounts of what the missionaries did specifically? And perhaps you could elaborate a little bit on your experience, if you'd be so kind to enlighten us.
Thank you, Ian. I would first say it was a gift to me to be able to be on the panel. I felt it was a privilege to be able to just be with the other people that were on the panel and to share our stories, to be appreciated. But I need to say that the most important thing I wanted to say that night and did was that I was looking at everyone, looking at us, and they're thinking, you're missionaries. And I'm thinking, you're the missionaries, because I think we all are in some way, or whatever our capacity is, however we are living our lives, we're all missionaries. And that's really, I don't know what you want to hear, Ian. I was a late in life missionary. The other people have been in for 30, 40 years. And it was the last decade of my working career that I qualified to be on that panel, that was even on my resume. Although I had thought about it from the time I was a kid, it didn't happen until much later. And so I'm in the contemporary, much different story than they would have had. We did have email. We worked with people who came from that era when you put your kid on a boat and sent them off to school and you didn't see them for 6 months or a year. Whereas before I actually left, Singapore and South Korea is where we were. We did have email by then. So you can imagine the difference between how I lived and worked and how the people that you just watched up there. I have great admiration for them. Now, I also have to say, I never worked so hard in my life. I was a teacher in both countries. In Seoul, both my husband and I had equal responsibility, and I had 300 students all the time. And I had to not only help them learn to speak, I taught English conversation. We had to grade and rank them, 300 students. So that's like me, do you speak better than me? That's not an easy decision to make. You have to figure out how to do it. And maybe I would still be doing it if I didn't have to grade and rank. I love the teaching. And just my summary that night was when we retired, and that was retirement from an employment status. My husband, it included 11 years of our lives. And my husband said it was 25 years too short.
It's definitely a calling, right?
Thank you, Kathleen.
You have another one? Okay.
I was just going to share that my father's sister married Louis Scudder. So that was from the Scudder family. And that would have been probably in the 1936 era. They became the 100th and 101st missionaries of the Scudder family, which was amazing. And they were sent to Iraq as medical missionaries. My uncle was a doctor and my aunt was a nurse. They were then transferred to Kuwait. Eventually, my uncle did die in Kuwait and was buried immediately because it's different there. It's very warm and they need to bury quickly. My aunt continued to stay there. The Reformed Church in America did close the hospital that they had started. And of course, they felt very badly. And there were lots of not such nice feelings toward that because they had worked all their life to establish that. However, it was probably time because Kuwait became very wealthy and did not need us to support a hospital at that point. My aunt continued to work for the government in that hospital as a director and was very close to the leading people in the country. She would come back every year, and the 1 year that she came back, she was with my sister in California, and my sister had to wake her up and say Saddam Hussein had just taken over Kuwait. She said, "Oh, he'll be gone in 3 days." But of course he wasn't. And they took over her house, which was up on a bluff overlooking the Gulf. And then they lost almost everything. So there's nothing that they could bring back here because the Saddam Hussein and his group took it over.
Oh, that's fascinating. 100th and 101. And how many since then, do you know? Sorry, now I'm asking questions.
I don't know that, but I do know that her daughter, they had 4 children. And when you talk about sending your children away to school, those children were sent at the age of 7 from Kuwait to India, to Kodaikanal, and that's where they received their education.
Then the oldest daughter was Marilyn Scudder, Dr. Marilyn Scudder. She was a Hope graduate and she never married, and she was an ophthalmologist and was stationed in Africa, and was part of, sometimes she would fly into the bush and all the people would line up and she would treat them. There were a lot of eye disease there. She retired there and died there and is buried there. Then her brother, that was the next child, he was a minister and lived in Cyprus, in Syria, I think, and in Lebanon, and was had a church and also worked with the different Christian councils in the Middle East.
It's a fascinating story. It's interesting when you're talking about sending children away, and that's in the Joint Archives. There's a lot of information from some of the children and what their lives were like being sent away at a very young age and not being with their families. That was part of what was done at the time. So.
One other question from online, Larry, I would appreciate if maybe Ricki can address this, or maybe Kathleen knows. Was there a reason why Asia was the target for RCA missionaries? You mentioned specifically Japan, India, and China in your presentation, but was there a reason why that area of the globe was targeted by the RCA?
I
Kathleen?
think, yes, I defer.
I hear in your question, Ian, that the missionaries went. We were invited. That was a totally different era, because now a lot of missionaries, and I didn't go with the RCA church, I was with the United Methodist Church. I probably should have said that. But now we would not just say, hey, we need a missionary in wherever. We would wait until the invitation came. And so those were both in Singapore. It came from the church. We worked in local schools. And in Seoul, it also came from the Methodist school that was looking for people who had our skills. And it was as though we were interviewed. We were subject. We had to send our resumes, our what do you call your transcripts from when you were in college? Who does that anymore? But we had to meet their requirements in order to be invited to come. So that's a totally different story from someone who says, yeah, all my life I thought I was supposed to go to the Congo and I'm going to go no matter what. I'm going to go on my own, or however I'm going to figure out how to do it. Ours was a call from, we had spent 2 or 3 years preparing to get ready. And we had to do a lot to prepare. We had to write our philosophy of this and of this and of this. We had to be psychoanalyzed. I mean, there was a lot we had to do, and that was finished. And then we said, okay, put us in a drawer. We're going to do this when we retire. Then God doesn't always, God's timing isn't always the same as the one you think yours is. And so it was just a short time after that this request came from Singapore, and they said, you match this perfectly. We're the one, we hope you'll consider going. Consider was in it too. You know, we could have said no. We did say no. We came back from Singapore. We were here for 2.5 years, and we were peace with justice advocates. That's another whole story. We did that in the States. But during that time, we were asked to go to China, and we didn't think we fit. And it wouldn't have worked the way it did in Seoul. We belonged there for those 5 years. And it was a wonderful 5 years. When we talk about kids being sent, mine was the totally opposite. Yes, those missionaries sent their children away. We left our children. Children are supposed to leave their parents, right? But we were the ones that left our adult children by that time. And that's not easy. And we had to do it twice. You know, we came back, thought we were back here to stay. And then the next thing we know, we're leaving again. And I have to admit that I argued with God a little bit. And I said, do I really have to do this again? And of course, the answer was, yes, you do. And it was, like I said, 25 years too short.
Well, what I find interesting is the fact that you had to be invited, which these women that I talked about weren't. I mean, it was the church sending them for their reasons. And many of them were good reasons and altruistic reasons, but some of them probably were not as welcome as being invited. I mean, they wanted you there. That's terrific. I didn't know that. But to answer the question about Asia, I think it was just, we highlighted these women. I think there were people in the 19th and 20th century that served in other countries as well.
Commenting on Amoy then, why was Amoy chosen? The first Reformed church missionary to go to Amoy was in 1842, which was the first year that China opened to the outside world. Before 1840, only Shanghai handled any international trade at all, and China was completely closed. They hated outsiders. They preached that, any foreign devils couldn't come in. And so they opened 5 ports in 1842, and the first Reformed church missionary fairly soon after that came there. For one thing, they now had the protection of the British having military there to provide some cover in a country that had just come through a tremendous war. But he was there for about 2 years. He brought a doctor with him. And so right away, they began to have a little bit of a missionary clinic there. David Abeel was his name, Abeel. And so as the decades went by, there were further RCA missionaries that came to that place. As the number of American missionaries swelled in each decade, China was sort of carved up into not having the different denominations overlap and duplicate each other's efforts. And so the English Presbyterians and the Reformed Church and the United Church of Christ, I think, combined their efforts and kind of had Amoy as sort of a sphere of influence. And then there was sort of, I wouldn't say it was complete, but an agreement that Baptists would be around Shanghai and Reformed Church would be around Amoy, and maybe another Chinese center would be some of the other denominations. The Catholics did not participate in that because they had their own division of China. But the Protestant denominations that were sending missionaries were starting to organize and be more ecumenical in the way that they tried to make best use of what resources were available. And then Dr. John Oddie went to Amoy in 1883 and there founded 3 different hospitals that eventually lasted through the decades and drew a lot of missionaries and medical missionaries to that place. At that time, India had already established this awesome medical missionary center in Vellore around the Scudders, and that was beginning to flourish. But China the RCA had not sent any medical people to China yet after that first doctor who went with Abeel. But now Dr. Oddie would try to form hospitals there. And so today there is one hospital in Amoy that honors John Oddie, a graduate of Hope College who grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, as the founder of this great big new hospital in Amoy that the communists put up, all this Chinese leadership, and yet they have put Dr. John Oddie, Dutch American doctor, nothing about being a missionary on the sign, as honored as the founder. So even today, his legacy lasts there, even though right on that site was not the site of any of the hospitals that he organized. It was just a respect for the long period of time he spent there from the 1880s until he died there in 1910. So he married the daughter of the first president of Hope College. And so one of the very first women to graduate from Hope College, she's this beautiful, slender, well-born. The Phelps were a wealthy family. She goes off with her missionary husband to begin mission work in China, and she had a great interest in writing. And she sent many letters back where she shows she thinks of herself as an ambassador to create new connections between people back home and understanding where they are, what they're doing, so that Americans don't just have an idea of handing out Bibles in the rice paddies, but they have a more realistic idea of what the missionaries actually have to do and what they encounter where they go. So then by the time the RCA was established there, they cooperated very well with any other denomination that was going to be active in China. Would you say that in Korea also there was good ecumenical work between the different denominations that were in work in Korea? And wasn't it Underwood in Korea that made a tremendous impact on Korea? Yeah, Underwood Hospital. So when Billy Graham went to Korea in 1973, 1.5 million Koreans gathered in person to celebrate Billy Graham landing in Korea. That's the kind of curiosity and intention and impact that he had had. And I think overall, the effect of the missionaries in South Korea was just overwhelming, wasn't it?
Know that I need to even add anything to that. And I'm blanking on the United Methodist missionary that came with Underwood, because they came on the same ship. And that would have been in when? Late 1800s, early 1900s. So the church is very strong in both countries, in both Singapore and in Korea.
The name Elizabeth, let's see, Wolvert, no, Edith Wolvert jumped out at me because she illustrates, I think, the kind of long-term connections that were established between Hope College and these missionaries. When her husband, Anthony, died, she came back here, and I think she had 2 daughters. And Hope College found 3. Okay, Hope College found a place for them. She became kind of like a matron at Voorhees Hall, still on campus. And she noticed how sparsely furnished the living room was there. And she asked President Dimon at that time if there was some money that they could make, some nice curtains maybe, and some, soft couch and so on. And Dimon said, we don't have money for that. We need money for our religion department. And so Edith talked to some of her friends in local churches. I think she was a member of Third Church. And she mentioned to the women there that there's a need really at Hope College to really make things more comfortable for the women students there. And that group of women attracted other women's groups in what was then a kind of regional synod of the Chicago area. And it started something called the Women's League for Hope College. And eventually they put on Hope College Village Squares to raise money for mainly dormitories, men and women's dormitories. And she was the impetus behind that whole movement. And Hope College also took care of Frances Oddie when she came back, I think. What kind of job did she have? Do you recall? Was she like a dean of women students or something?
I don't know that she was a dean of women's students. I didn't realize that Frances Oddie had some position at Hope College. She was certainly a regal figure, very revered, very tiny, but kind of off-putting. Frances Oddie was actually the grandmother by marriage of my husband, John DeVelder. So he knew her as a little boy, as one of those grandmothers you might be afraid of, kind of. And she would sort of invite herself over for dinner. I'll be coming for dinner, she would say to John's mother. And so she was a little bit imperial, but everyone around town knew and respected Frances Oddie because of what she had been through. When John Oddie died in 1910, she came back to Grand Rapids and lived there through a large part of her life. And then when she was quite old, she came to Holland and retired in Holland. But another missionary that Hope College found a place for and took care of was Elizabeth Rensters Kepi, who was mentioned in one of these, in the slide previous to this one. She's mentioned as someone else who's leaving again for China. And she was my grandmother's sister. So there are two grandnieces of these people here. I'm not direct, I'm distantly related to Edith Walford, but I'm more closely related to Elizabeth Renskers Kepi, who married a missionary, and they were both very active in Amoy. Another earmark of the women missionaries in Amoy is they were not housekeepers. They employed housekeepers because it was very, very cheap to do that. And that was the style of the time. It wasn't like they were too high class to do their own work. It's that they were very involved in the teaching and the mission. And big important point, the women missionaries in the classes of Amoy were voting members of the classes. And those who know what the structure is in the RCI will be very impressed with that. That's giving a lot of power to women very early, as the Amoy classes recognized more than people did back home, how central and how much writing and teaching and work and planning and organization they were doing, in addition to just raising their families and keeping house. So it was an opportunity for, beginning with Frances Oddie, to be way more involved than we sometimes realize. And obviously you were very involved.
You might wonder, maybe not, do relationships continue after you go through this? It's been 20 years now since I've lived here, since I came back from Seoul. About a month ago, less, one of my sons was married, and there was a person there from Singapore who was our student. That tells you a lot. You know how far away Singapore is? I'll digress just a little bit. When we were interviewed as to where we might be going, we were asked, is there a place you would like to go? And we said, we know a little bit of Spanish. I didn't really, but I had tried to study it. But I said, I don't do very well in cold climates. Do you know where Singapore is? So I figured God laughed on that one. You don't want to be cold? Okay, 1 degree from the equator, that'll do it. But I have a very close relationship with students even at this time. So this man was here from Singapore, and then there was another family that came via Toronto who was our student in Seoul. And she had just gotten her PhD in a school in Toronto. They're citizens there now. And they brought their children with them to the party. And they have a son named Philip, who's named after my husband. And his mother wanted him to go to the cemetery and get acquainted with his namesake. So we did. We all of those people I just mentioned went, we sat on the grass and told Phil stories. So that 12-year-old went home knowing a little bit more about his namesake than he did when he came. I'm sure it meant nothing to him before. So hopefully it does now. And there was another, she's like our family. She had a lot of our students went to the West to connect to Canada or to Europe or to the States for school. That's why they needed to speak English well. That's why we were there, because we don't speak English with a Korean accent. The Korean teachers taught everything else. They taught the grammar, they taught the literature, they taught everything else in Korean. A lot of them didn't even know if their teachers could speak English. They would say to us, can they speak English? And so they really didn't know. So we were there to help them become translators, work in the government, anything professional that would demand good English conversation. So this one student that I was going to mention had a lot of them had all of their college, their post-high school education in some other country. And then they would go back. And of course, then they were really they had a fine education at that point because they could think like a Westerner and they could think like an Asian, and function in either place. So this Yoon Sun she'd gone to a school in Massachusetts, then she went to Harvard, then she went to U of M and got a PhD and married another PhD that was in Ann Arbor. And then they went back to live there. And I hear from them all the time. She sends me pictures of her children, and she's teaching in the Harvard of South Korea. Same place where her father has taught for years and years. So I do, there's a continuation. It isn't like, yeah, that was a long time ago and I don't even think about it. The networking is never over. And your question about different denominations in different places, I probably should mention that we had a retreat once a year for several denominations to meet together. We knew each other, whether we were, whatever church we were representing. So that there was a real effort to do that.
Just a little aside, Mrs. Kepi was my house mother when I was a freshman. But here's something that I mull over. We have a really close friend in Japan. He's 56 years old. We met him when he was 16. A Reformed church in Hudsonville brought a bunch of kids over from a Christian junior high school for the summer, and we connected, and he was at our house, and we loved him dearly and have been back and forth to visit him, and he here to visit us and his whole family to come here. But one time I said to him, now, why is it that you went to a Christian middle school, a Christian high school, a Christian college, and he was even married on the campus, but you're not a Christian? And he said, there was just such a nice atmosphere. And I thought, whoa, missionaries really have a tough time, because in a way, nothing happened with his perspective on being a Christian. But he's a good man and he's leading a good life. But it's interesting. And I think it's a very tough job that missionaries have, especially if they're preaching the word.
Thank you. Larry, we just want to be respectful of Ricki's time here, and we're
Yes.
running out.
Yes, and anybody else have a question they might want to ask Ricki before we?
I think it's been fascinating listening
Yes.
to all of you. So
Yeah.
thank you.
And you're
Thank-
all welcome to stay in the classroom and continue to discuss if
Right.
you'd like.
Thank you for your comments, and especially thank you, Ricki, for giving us this great presentation.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye Zoom, folks.